Hello and welcome to the Michael Mamas Show, Ancient Secrets Revealed. I am your host, Michael Mamas, and we are coming to you from Mount Soma, home of the Sri Someshwara Temple in the mountains of Western North Carolina. And, there's been a lot of, obviously, conversation about the assassination attempt and how incredible it was that, the bullet just grazed his ear. And people are talking about divine intervention a lot. And so I thought we'd go into like a deeper understanding. What is divine intervention? Does it even exist? And if so, what is it? I think the fact that, you're watching this webcast, this podcast makes it clear that, you're wanting a deeper understanding. That's what this whole thing is all about. This whole podcast series is all about. And there are people that they're not interested, they don't, divine intervention, good enough. Okay. Kind of reminds me of that Cookie Monster, Scotty in Sesame Street.
Yeah.
Says, C is for cookie. That's good enough for me. Cookie,
Right.
cookie. Yeah. And this is a very tangential point, but that's kind of one of the problems why a lot of people are turning their back on religion and spirituality, I think, is because the understanding is just not sophisticated enough. It's there, but it's just not really something that's discussed, really. So, okay, what is divine intervention? Let's take a look at it. God's grace, fate, destiny, karma, guardian angels, all that stuff. And so to really see, to even begin to understand what it's about, we have to take a look, at least briefly, to the nature of existence, the structure of existence. What is it? And there's what in the Vedic literature is called Chaitanya. Sometimes it's referred to as the absolute. Modern physicists call it the unified field. It's that one thing that is beyond relativity. So it's like a field of no thingness in that sense, because it's not of material or relative existence. And it's a source, it's the source of relativity. Relativity is born out of it. But when you go into relativity, then it becomes really a very different thing. And that's where, Newton's laws of physics come in, and action, reaction, and cause and effect. And so in the absolute in Chaitanya, it's beyond relativity. So there's not that limitation. It's a field of all possibilities, a field of infinite dynamism, infinite intelligence, infinite wisdom, divinity, pure consciousness. It is pure consciousness. Whereas in relativity, the world that we live in, or we seem to be most familiar with for sure, it's all subject to the laws of karma, cause and effect. And so in the field of relativity, I compare it to like a bunch of billiard balls, and you roll them around on a pool table and a billiard table. And if you knew the speed and the spin and the elasticity of the cushions and the resistance of the felt and so on and so forth, you could calculate exactly where those balls are going to end up. And so the idea of predetermination is that this field of relativity is just a field of cause and effect. It's just a great big billiard table. And so if you had a big enough computer, you could predict the future and you'd be right all the time. So now here's where it gets interesting, is that there's cause and effect, there's relativity, there's the absolute, but what is everything in its essence? Everything in its essence, its source, the divinity within is that field of infinite freedom, that field of absolute, Chaitanya, beyond relativity, beyond cause and effect. And so it's a source of infinite freedom. Now, when we think of karma and cause and effect, there's an analogy I use because it's tiered. It exists on different levels. And on one level, you look at that tiering as currents, waves, clouds, if you will, motion, movement around the planet. And on the level that we're speaking of now, we could say that those are karmic currents. They're karmic waves. They're waves that over time flow through the entire planet. And it's all interconnected, but nevertheless, there are waves there. They're called karmic waves. So the notion of divine intervention, if you will, and you see what we're talking about. There's God's will, and God's will comes in two forms. God's will comes from within Chaitanya, within the Absolute, that source of infinite freedom, but also the whole mechanic of relativity, the whole field of karma, the whole field of relativity is also God's will. It's set in motion, it's cause and effect. Those are the laws of nature, and there you go. And so now we have these waves of karma. And throughout history, we can see all sorts. A historical account in a deeper sense is just an accounting of karmic waves. And those determine, it's just momentum. It's cause and effect. It's the laws of mechanics, of motion. And it doesn't just affect material things in that sense, but also mindsets, mentalities. Affects everything in the relative. It's all relative. So in one sense, when we speak of divine intervention, we can just say, well, that's from a perspective of relativity, which it's one of the two realities. There's infinite freedom of the Absolute, and there's cause and effect, predetermination in the relative. And so within the domain of relativity, divine intervention, well, really, it's just cause and effect on that level in relative. It's just cause and effect. But it's like currents, it's like waves that swirl around the planet over time. And so in one sense, we could say that right now, Donald Trump is riding a karmic wave. And it's that karmic wave, that momentum that carries a person. George Washington, way back during the Revolution, he, interestingly enough, and this actually, there's a whole lecture I do about geoenergetics. That's a different lecture, but anyway, it kind of relates because George Washington, there was a barrage of bullets coming at him, not a single one hit. Everybody said it's divine intervention. George Patton, the general in World War II, he just knew that he was almost like invincible, and he would stand there and bullets would be flying around. MacArthur was the same way. And they just knew that they weren't going to get struck. Now, we could say that they're just riding a karmic wave. They could feel the wave. You can feel the wave. There's a momentum there. I think right now we're feeling the momentum of the MAGA movement, the Republican movement. I mean, you can just, good or bad, right or wrong, it is palpable, And so that is all just cause and effect, divine intervention on that level, within the arena of the relative. But now there's also divine intervention that actually does come from within the Absolute. And that isn't just, God waving his hand over everything or what have you, but it's also every individual has a degree of access to that depth of their being, the Absolute, Chaitanya, the divinity, goes through the what's called the Atma, the source of your being, the source of your individuality. And as you function from that, you become more free. You have more free will, so it's not all predetermined, you see? And what determines the magnitude, the degree of which you have free will? Well, just because you think you're free, just because you feel you're free, doesn't mean you are. That could all be karmic. The mind is largely karmic, how we think, what we feel. But there's also this other component that is coming from the absolute, and it is really a source of freedom where we can make choice. We're not just bound by the laws of karma. But now it gets really interesting, doesn't it? Because it's not just that there's God and relativity. There's a whole hierarchy of what we would call divinity, angels and the whole thing, But it's sort of like, to say it simplistically, maybe, God is not going to sit there and watch everything and say, okay, well, here's a little divine will here, and we'll just brush aside the karma and do a miracle and change that. It's too simplistic, really. And also there's a hierarchy. God's messengers, if you want to say it that way. And those all have personified correlates. That's one place where we don't appreciate enough the magnitude, the degree to which so much of existence, everything in existence really, has a personified correlate. And so there are personified correlates of divine will that's coming not from karma, though it could be karmic, but it could also be coming from the absolute, from Chaitanya. And these are what we call guardian angels. And so you could say, and could very much be rightly so, that there were guardian angels there that affected the whole thing, became an intermediary between the laws of karma and what actually happens, modulate it, And so you could say that that's God's will, but not from a karmic level, which is God's will, but also from the Chaitanya level, which is God's will, infinite freedom. And so the point is that we really don't know. I mean, it certainly feels like, my goodness, that he turned his head at just the right time. Certainly feels a certain way, and it could be. Was it karmic? Is he just riding a karmic wave? Because karmic waves create cultures, they create societies, they create civilizations. They create our daily life as well, but they're huge cycles of karmic waves. You could even say the yugas, the ages. They're modulated by karmic waves, and they come and ebb and flow. They cycle through the different yugas. Sun rises and sets. The laws of nature change over time, you see. But now it gets really interesting, because let's take an even deeper look at the mechanic here. And I think the best way to really do that and get a feeling for it, and we'll keep it really simple, but we'll talk a little bit about Heisenberg, the physicist, and the uncertainty principle. And the idea is, they did it, you see, this applies on all levels of existence. But, modern physics is in its infancy with respect to all this stuff. And so they do it like with an electron, And so they would say that an electron isn't a point. It's not a point. It's not a little particle like that. It's a probability wave. And so the idea is then when you interact with it, you precipitate it out into a point value. But really it's a probability wave. And probably we could, if we did like a bell curve, probably if you grab on the electron, you're going to find it here. It's possible that you'll find it out further on the bell curve, or even further, or you might even locate that electron on the other side of the moon. But probably it's going to be right here somewhere. So you get a bell curve. But that probability cloud and that bell curve doesn't just exist with, certainly not with an electron. It's life. It's life. And it affects also the way we think, the way we function, our mentalities. You see? So if we imagine, Einstein said he said he couldn't believe or something like that he said God didn't play dice with the universe. In other words, it's not just random chance, roll the dice and see where the probability rolls. No, it's modulated by free will, which comes out of the absolute. Is that making sense, Scotty?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's beautiful, isn't it?
Great. Yeah.
Yeah. And so when you take that, not just as it applies to an electron, but as it applies to life, as it applies to the personified correlates of the mechanics of existence, you get things like guardian angels. And guardian angels can determine where on that probability cloud a certain event's going to happen, how it's going to shake out. So in that sense, yeah, maybe so. Maybe the guardian angels were there and they shifted the probability cloud of where all those billiard balls and bowling rolling around on the pool table of all relative existence, exactly where they precipitated out.
So, Michael, there's a coherence or a perfection coming out of the absolute that's permeating this karmic, whatever in relativity.
It is.
That pulsates perfection.
Yeah, but the field of relativity is a field of imperfection. It's right. And so all sorts of bad things can happen when we're not living in full harmony with that source of infinite harmony of coherence, intelligence, etc., that's coming out of the unified field, that the unified field is a source of. Now, here's this gets really interesting, I think, because so let's take a look at that bell curve, that probability curve, and think of it in terms of not of individual's mentality, but of global mentality. People think a certain way, and we're very much subjected to the karma of how our minds work, how our hearts work, how we function. And that defines a probability cloud of human behavior, of the human mentality. And if you look at history, I mean, really, yeah, okay, what did they say, that French saying, the more things change, the less things change? Probability cloud that generally doesn't shift much. And so we keep repeating the same thing, be it Genghis Khan or the Taliban or Hitler or, the good, different civilizations, the great people, the bad people. Why hasn't that changed really? The more things change, the less things change. Because the probability cloud hasn't shifted. But imagine there was a way of actually shifting the probability cloud so that human mentality became more in harmony with nature, more divine. It wasn't probably that we would precipitate out a world with wars and hatred and anger and all these terrible things. But instead, by shifting the probability cloud, we shift human mentality to a divine place, not a horrible place. And the more that happens, the more freedom we have, doesn't it? Because we're more in harmony with nature. That's what it means. But nevertheless, there's still a probability cloud. And we can shift the nature of that bell curve, of that probability cloud, shift the nature of the bell curve. Did I say that okay, Scott?
Right, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Now, that is exactly, really, you could look at it this way, that is exactly what Mount Soma is about. Because as you clean the fishbowl of global consciousness, then the laws of karma aren't such that in the mechanic of karma, the waves of karma flowing over the planet, they aren't so gathered around and conditioning everything to function in an unconstructive way. Where we have, I mean, if all the money we spent on wars was spent on good things, everybody in the planet would be wealthy and living in abundance. It's ridiculous. And so what Mount Soma is about is cleaning the global consciousness, which will shift the bell curve, and we can live in harmony and peace. But now this is pretty far out thing. Speaking of an individual, there's a principle in physics called the tunnel effect. If you take one electron and you shoot it at a wall, it's usually going to just bounce off the wall. But there's a certain possibility every so often you'll find the electron on the other side of the wall. It's just way out there on the bell curve of probabilities, you see. Now we have free will. Imagine, they say we only use 10% of the brain. Imagine you had a physiology that was functioning fully in harmony, in full integration with the totality of your being. So you could then will, because that's what free will is. It's about where things precipitate out on the bell curve, right? So you have so much free will and you're so much integrated with the totality of all levels of your physiology that you can determine just by willing it. You don't have to think, oh, this electron, that electron. No. I want to walk through that wall. And all the electrons, everything, all the molecules, all the protons, everything just shifts, tunnel effect, and you just walk right through the wall. Maharishi Patanjali talked about techniques to develop that sort of integration of the physiology, and we hear about it now, and it just sounds like we're so engrossed into a certain type of bell curve with such a limited field of possibilities that we're so constrained in that it seems impossible. But there are all sorts of different, they're called siddhis. And from our perspective today, based on Kali Yuga that we live in, they call them supernatural powers. Really, they're natural powers. They're just inherent in the nature of what it means to be a fully integrated human being, So anyway, there's divine grace, and you could define really, I'd like to think of divine grace as what comes right out of the absolute, right from Chaitanya, maybe through guardian angels or whatever, but it's divine grace. And then there's karmic, and there are karmic waves. And if there's a big karmic wave that's pushing society in a particular direction, and you got somebody surfing, some people would say Donald Trump, that's surfing on the surface, riding that karmic wave, then a bullet comes at him and he turns his head at just the right moment. It's a karmic wave. Okay? So and then there's also free will, which is also, it's very similar to divine grace, except divine grace is more about what would be perceived as an external influence, like a guardian angel or something, whereas free will is coming from within the person's own being because they have access to that level of Chaitanya. In that sense, there's no such thing as good luck and bad luck. There's a question of karmic waves and degree to which we are aligned with our own divinity. So that's what Mount Soma is all about. We want to create a unified field generator, something to purify the environment so that people's minds aren't, the whole global mentality isn't so limited that we're thinking within a very narrow band. And so probably 99.999% of the time, this is what's going to shake out, and we become free and we start living more and more in harmony with nature. And it's just from that perspective. See, I think it's important. It's not like C is for cookie, that's good enough for me. Okay, divine intervention. But now we have a deeper understanding of the nature of it and the mechanic of it. And the better we understand it, the better we can work with it. And when you really get onto it, where does that culminate? It culminates into cleaning the global fishbowl. Mount Soma that has the technology. Let's just do it. why don't we? Because people are living in that narrow little bandwidth right on that particular part of that particular bell curve. Does that make sense, Scotty?
Absolutely.
All right. I think that's it. We'll just leave it right there. And I hope you enjoyed it. Hope it makes sense. Keep it simple, and if you need to listen to the podcast again, so be it. But thanks for listening, and look forward to talking to you next week. And I appreciate you listening, tuning in. Thank you.